I think at least that if nothing has been cleared up about the problem of freedom, at least we know why there is a problem in the first place. And we have a notion of the different approaches we can take to that problem. At least some of the, some of the approaches. Again, the problem of freedom is really a problem of whether you can reconcile our notion of freedom of the will, the notion that we uh, have the capacity to make truly free choices, with another sort of stubbornly entrenched notion that every event that happens in the universe happens as, go back to that Blackburn's definition of determinism, that it happens as the upshot of antecedent causes. That is, that this is a very, very deep and old problem in philosophy, and this chapter might, I think, be kind of frustrating in the sense that it is kind of utterly unresolved. And I think that a philosopher named Kant is mentioned here. He's very influential in this type of thinking, and Kant thought a lot about the problem of freedom. Like Blackburn, he thought that we simply had to concede, for all sorts of reasons, that human beings and conscious beings of any sort do have the capacity for freedom, because, well, because what? Um, we've seen that much rides on the outcome of this question, and in a way, the outcome is to a certain degree presupposed, because so much rides on it. Again, our notion of what it means to be human. We just believe that the capacity of freedom is one of the birthrights of being human. We believe that, or it's sort of built, freedom is built into our whole sort of notion of someone being held responsible for their actions. That is, if it were not possible for people to do other than what they did in any particular case, then it would make no sense to hold somebody responsible morally or legally for what they do. So, in a way, the whole thing is at least in a practical sense, predetermined. To confuse the matters more, to use that term in the context, but predetermined in the sense that how could we live in any other way? So we live under the assumption that we have the capacity to make free choices. As I said in the last talk, that does not mean that we have the capacity to make free choices. I think that is, just because we need to believe something in order to go on or lead lives. I mean, that has a lot of weight, but it does not determine the truth of the matter, does it? So we should see what the problem is, how, the problem of freedom, why freedom is a problem, and really that is, whether it can be reconciled with this notion of determinism. And we should see what the options are. I mean, if you think about it, okay, the problem is that it seems on the surface, at least, that our notion of determinism, some form of determinism, and events being the upshot of antecedent causes, is incompatible with our notion of a free choice, because that would, to a certain extent, freedom means not determined by antecedent causes. So that there is the problem. Now, what are the alternatives? Well, one alternative is to be a hard determinist or incompatibilist and say that determinism rules out truly free action. Now, we may appear to ourselves and to others to be acting freely, but we couldn't be, because that would be to grant this sort of unwarranted exception to the rule of determinism. So one alternative is to say that freedom is an illusion, and some people believe that, certainly do, and whether that can be reconciled with the way they live their lives or the way they think of human beings in general is another question. But certainly it is an available option. The other option is to deny determinism, and some people would do that too. to say that, well, determinism is really utterly too simple, that the notion that any event is the result of antecedent causes does seem to work well in physics, I guess, with some complications with modern quantum physics. But in our understanding of physical events, it seems to work really well. But it may be that it is not a global or universal truth about events, and that it simplifies things too much. So you could deny determinism and then and say that, well, freedom is obviously something that we're capable of, so determinism is wrong. That is not a path that I think, at least my reading of it, that Blackburn really explores. The path that he does explore, to really takes up most of the chapter, is the option of compatibilism. That is, to accept both determinism and freedom of the will, but to try to give an account that shows that they are not actually incompatible. And it makes for a kind of frustrating reading, but I think that Blackburn kind of explains himself. This is a quote, rather long quote, from bottom of page 103 to the top of page 104. Let me just read it. He says, "The conceptual engineering we are doing at this point is supposed to tease out or make explicit real elements in our thinking." That is, this notion of conceptual engineering is to sort of say what concepts are at work in our ordinary thinking. We want to highlight and try to encapsulate things like this. We do make a distinction between changing the past, which we cannot do, and acting differently than we do, and which we sometimes can do. We do have discriminating practices of blame. That is, we blame people for some things, like being lazy, but not for other things, like not being able to jump really high or something. We do make a distinction between being ill, being sick, and being bad. We do allow some excuses and disallow others. The philosophical analysis is supposed to give us intellectual control of all this. That is, to make ourselves aware of the kind of conceptual distinctions that we actually make. To become more aware of them is, I suppose, to give ourselves a chance to be more in control. It is supposed to exhibit it all, not just as an irrational jumble of disconnected habits, but as the application of a reasonable, defensible set of concepts and principles. That is, presumably, the concepts and distinctions that we make do make sense together as a way of approaching the world. It is because it is hard to do this that philosophy is hard. The compatibilist account is a piece of engineering. That is, the compatibilist account of the relation between determinism and freedom is this. How do we actually work these things out in our actual thought? Either plotting our extant concepts or designing improved ones. That is, it may be that we're not only describing the way that we deal with the world conceptually, but it may be that we should change as a result of our examination, that we should change some of these concepts. It has to answer to the ways we often think, or think we are best in control of the problems that face us. It's kind of an apology, I think, for what he's doing, because clearly Blackburn is a compatibilist. Clearly, that some variation of that account that he gives towards the beginning of the chapter, where he makes an analogy between the human process of making a free decision and a software program, that seems to be the starting point for his notion of what the best way to deal with the so-called problem of freedom is to say that perhaps we are not absolutely free. That is, that we are not free in the sense that we could decide anything, because we have certain beliefs, desires, habits, dispositions, all sorts of influences that program us in a way. But he wants to insist that programming is not something that is beyond our control to change. That is, if he gives an example a couple times of parents of a teenager, a teenage girl who they think spends too much time and money on cosmetics. Does it make sense to blame her for that? Well, he suggests that in a sense, no. He hypothesizes that she is, in a way, the victim of social forces, gender stereotypes, media-induced ideas about beauty and appearance. So, in a certain way, she's helpless. That she couldn't do otherwise. But the parents don't really accept this. They say, well, you could do otherwise. You could change, which she certainly could, as a result of her own thinking or growing up, and certainly she will change. People like that do change. Teenage years are not all there is to say about our character and the way we live our lives. And he gives many examples of that. He mentions the infamous Dan White Twinkie defense. Perhaps before your time, there was terrible murder, political murder in San Francisco, I think in the late 70s, where a local politician became very angry and murdered in cold blood the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, and another politician, Harvey Milk, a very important gay rights activist and politician, very, very important, and a lot has been written about him. But Dan White's defense, or at least his defense lawyer came up with this defense that, at least in part, he could be excused in the murder because of high sugar content because he was eating too many Twinkies, the infamous Twinkie defense. Blackburn gives that as an example of an absolutely absurd defense, because the basis of the defense is that somehow or another Dan White should not have to take responsibility for these killings because of having too much sugar in his system. He rejects that utterly. He says, of course that's not a good excuse. That's no excuse at all. Now, it could be, there are different, some people have, I would imagine, I would say justly, been excused of crimes because of brain tumors and things like that. So it's really not so simple. I mean, that, sometimes people are ill, and they do things because of illness rather than do things that they do out of choice, and we have to acknowledge that. But where you draw the line is very difficult. I don't think that the compatibilist account, let's say, is kind of descriptive. This is how we do it. This is how we deal with the question of freedom and responsibility, and sometimes we clearly attribute responsibility to people for their actions, and sometimes we don't. And the line is very kind of moving and gray and fuzzy, but this is kind of how we do it. That is to assume that freedom to some degree is possible, and in some cases people are free in their actions. They could have done differently than they did. They are responsible, therefore, for those actions, and sometimes they're not. But it doesn't do away with the fundamental difficulty of reconciling the determinism with human freedom, because even if we acknowledge that we are to agree that our programming is to a degree flexible and that we can change it in the future, anything that we do, somebody might, and this is the whole mini Martian invasion meaning of that example, is that anything that we do, any particular action we can do, can be attributed to that so-called programming, and so that act might be said to be not free at all. It's a result of our programming, and yes, our programming changes, but in any particular case we do the things that we do because of our programming. That doesn't do away with the fundamental problem, and maybe nothing ever could. I mean, Kant believed that the problem was to a certain degree insoluble, because the determinist argument was no better or no worse than the freedom of the will argument, and that this was a endless and irresolvable difference of opinion in metaphysics. So the compatibilist argument asks us to think of things in a different way, but it doesn't. I would say it seeks to save our fundamental intuitions about freedom and how it's compatible with science, but it doesn't really do away with the fundamental problem.